The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a soft drum against the roof and the windows, a rhythm I had grown accustomed to in the quiet of my apartment. I was sitting at the edge of the sofa, a cup of black coffee warming my hands, when the knock came. It was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the door to find Molly standing there, soaked through, her hair clinging to her face, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something I couldn't immediately. She was holding herself like she needed to contain herself, as though the world had been pressing on her from all sides, and she'd just reached her limit. "It's just for tonight," she said, almost as a question, almost as a dare. Her voice had that fragile, the kind that makes you want to step back and measure your, but also the kind that quietly demands to be met with calm, steady presence. I didn't ask why she was. I didn't ask why tonight. I simply stepped aside and gestured her in. "Let's see about tomorrow," I said. The words felt enough, simple and certain, without intrusion. She hesitated in the doorway, shivering, and I grabbed a thick towel from the rack. The touch was casual, nothing forced but careful. She let me wrap it around her shoulders, and I guided her to the sofa. The apartment smelled faintly of books, and the remnants of my coffee, an ordinary scent, but it seemed to settle her just enough to breathe a little easier. We sat there for a while, in silence. The sound of the rain filled the space between us, and it wasn't uncomfortable. I watched her, taking note of the small ways she relaxed when she believed no one was watching. A slight slump of her shoulders, a soft exhale, a hand smoothing the wet strands of hair off her forehead. I didn't comment, didn't push. I only made space. "I don't usually—" she started, then stopped. Her gaze flicked to mine, uncertain. I nodded slightly, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. She nodded back. She didn't have to finish the sentence. The understanding hung between us, unspoken, but mutual. I went to the kitchen and made us tea, the steam curling up between us like a quiet promise of normalcy. When I returned, she was still sitting there, her eyes tracing the patterns of the rug as though they were a map she could read to somewhere safer. I placed the mugs on the table, careful not to spill, careful not to break the fragile balance. "Do you want to talk?" I asked. My tone was calm, even, the sort of evenness that doesn't demand anything but offers everything. She shook her head. "Not yet," she whispered, and I didn't press. I understood. Not yet was enough. Time passed slowly. Rain continued its steady percussion, and we simply existed in the same room. Occasionally, her gaze would meet mine, tentative and searching, and I would offer a small, steady smile, a silent signal that she could stay, that she could be as she was without explanation or apology. When the storm outside began to thin, when the light from the street lamps flickered in through the window, she shifted slightly on the sofa, a subtle sign of relief. I handed her a blanket, and she wrapped herself in it, the fabric enveloping her like a quiet shield. For the first time that night, she let herself lean back against the cushions fully, her head tilting just slightly, her expression softening. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My presence alone seemed enough. In that quiet, under the rain and the gentle hum of a city that moved on without noticing us, I felt the start of something unspoken yet undeniable. She was still fragile, still wary, but for a brief night, she had chosen to be here, and I had offered her space to simply exist. Nothing more, nothing less. It was enough. The night stretched quietly around us, and in that stillness, I realized that sometimes the most profound connections begin not with words or declarations, but with the simple act of letting someone stay. Morning arrived softly, with a pale light filtering through the blinds and casting thin stripes across the floor. Molly was still on the sofa when I came out of the kitchen, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She hadn't moved much since the night before. Her posture was a careful balance between rest and alertness, as if she were ready to vanish the moment the world intruded. "Here," I said, placing the mug near her. "Black or with sugar?" She blinked at me, a little startled, and murmured, "Black, thanks." The word was small, almost fragile, but it carried an odd kind of relief, like she had been waiting for permission to be normal, to drink coffee without expectation. I sat down in the armchair across from her, letting the warmth of my own cup seep through my palms. We sipped in silence, the only sound being the slow drip of rain that had lingered, now reduced to occasional patters on the window. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the way her fingers traced the rim of the mug absent-mindedly, the faint tension in her shoulders gradually loosening. "You don't have to go anywhere today," I said softly, not as an invitation, more as an observation. "It's raining, and, well, you can stay if you want." Her gaze met mine, tentative, almost testing me. "I don't usually, people usually have somewhere to be," she admitted, her voice lower this time, carrying that hint of vulnerability that made me careful not to rush anything. I smiled, not broadly, just enough to let her know that my presence wasn't conditional on explanations or performances. "Sometimes staying still is enough," I said. The simplicity of it seemed to ease something. A faint smile tugged at her lips, almost imperceptible, but genuine. We spent the next hour in quiet rhythm. I read from a book near the window, and she occasionally glanced at the pages, not quite interested in the text, but perhaps in the quiet companionship. Sometimes she would look out at the as if trying to memorize its patterns, and I would follow her gaze, silently sharing. At one point, she set down her cup and tucked her knees close to her chest. "I'm not very good at this," she said, the words drifting into the space between us. I didn't press her for clarification. Instead, I reached over and moved a blanket from the back of the sofa toward her, letting it fall around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, protective, entirely without expectation, but it seemed to settle her. "I know," I replied softly, "and that's fine. You don't have to be good at it. You just exist. That's enough." She exhaled, a long, slow release, the kind of breath that carries both relief and exhaustion. She leaned back against the cushion, letting the blanket cocoon her, and for a moment, I saw her not as someone fragile or lost, but as someone choosing to let herself rest, to accept that she could be safe for just a little. The hours passed quietly. We talked in fragments, about the weather, the book I was reading, trivial details of the neighborhood, but always gently, never pushing too far, leaving room for silence when she needed it. I noticed the way she began to relax into the space, how her movements became less guarded, less measured, almost like a plant opening toward sunlight after a long winter. When the rain tapered off and the clouds began to break, a faint warmth came through the windows. She adjusted the blanket, her expression softer now, more contemplative. I stayed in my chair, watching, knowing that nothing extraordinary had happened, yet sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the quiet, shared space of an ordinary morning. It was not a declaration, not a promise. It was simply the beginning of trust, the fragile thread of someone choosing to stay without being forced, and me, choosing to be there without expecting more than her presence. And in that, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible weight of intimacy, slow and careful, like the first notes of a song that neither of us could yet name. The afternoon arrived in slow, uneven patches of light, the kind that filters through half-drawn blinds and casts a faint warmth across the room, but never enough to feel fully sunny. Molly was still there, sitting near the window with her knees drawn up, staring out at the street as if it held the answers to questions she couldn't yet ask aloud. I kept my distance in the kitchen, preparing a small snack, just simple bread and cheese, enough to fill the air with ordinary smells, grounding the space in the mundane. She didn't look at me when I placed the plate on the coffee table. Instead, her fingers traced a worn spot on the arm of the sofa, the gesture small but deliberate, as if she was measuring the world by its textures. I sat down across from her, watching, noting the way her eyes would flicker to mine for a fraction of a second, then away again, like she was testing the waters of presence without committing to. "Do you ever feel like things don't have to be said?" I asked quietly, the question barely rising above the soft hum of the refrigerator. She blinked, her gaze settling on me for the first time in what felt like hours. "Sometimes," she murmured, her voice low, almost shy. "But I usually feel like I have to explain everything." I nodded. "I understand, but not everything needs explained. Some things can just be." The words floated between us, simple, but weighted with intent. I wasn't trying to push her. I was offering a space where she could exist without the burden of justification. She looked down at the floor, a faint, nervous smile crossing her face. "I'm not sure I know how to do that," she admitted. I sensed the hesitation, the fear of being too much or too little, the kind of fear that accumulates quietly over years and never really leaves. "Then we start small," I said. "No pressure, no expectations, just small steps. Like this one, right now, here." I gestured vaguely at the room, at the quiet, at the shared stillness. Her shoulders eased slightly, though her posture still held a delicate tension, a reminder of the walls she carried inside herself. We spent the next hour in that quiet, a strange intimacy forming not through conversation, but through shared breathing, shared presence. She picked at the edge of the blanket draped over her lap, and I noticed the way her fingers twitched as if deciding whether it was safe to let go of control. I didn't comment, didn't offer advice. I simply let her be, and she, in turn, seemed to notice that I wasn't going anywhere. At one point, she shifted on the sofa, finally letting her back rest fully against the cushions. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable, but to me, it was a quiet surrender to the moment. I caught my own breath slightly at the simplicity of it, how much weight could be carried in such a small act. When she finally spoke again, it was almost an afterthought. I think I can stay for a little longer," she said. Her words weren't dramatic. They didn't carry grand declarations or urgency. They simply acknowledged presence, a recognition that being together in silence was enough. I offered her a small smile, one that didn't demand anything, only mirrored what I felt. A quiet acknowledgement, a patient acceptance. The room stayed calm, the light shifting slowly as the afternoon wore on, each second filled with the sort of unspoken understanding that sometimes carries more weight than words ever could. And in that shared stillness, something fragile began to grow. Not a promise, not a plan, but the first real sense that Molly could be present without fear, and that I could be steady enough. The quiet became a rhythm, a foundation, but the fragile architecture of trust slowly taking shape. The evening settled in with a slow gray light, the kind that stretches shadows across the room, makes everything feel both familiar and a little uncertain. Molly hadn't said much since the morning, but I could sense her shifting unease, the kind that comes from not knowing whether she truly belonged somewhere, or whether she even wanted to. I had prepared dinner, something simple, roasted vegetables and rice, enough to fill the air with warmth and routine, the sort of comfort that doesn't demand attention. She moved cautiously around the kitchen, hovering near the counter as if she didn't fully trust the space yet. I didn't ask her to leave or stay. I didn't comment on her hesitations. Instead, I placed the plates on the table and gestured toward a chair. "Sit," I said softly. "Eat when you're ready." Her eyes flicked to mine, a subtle negotiation in their glance, and she finally sat, picking at her food with careful. She didn't speak, didn't make demands or jokes, and I let her take the rhythm of the room in her own time. There was no rush, no schedule, only the quiet hum of the apartment and the low simmer of the stove still faintly warming the kitchen. After dinner, she wandered toward the window, tracing raindrops with her fingers. I poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to her without asking. "Here," I said, "for the rain." She took it cautiously, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. I didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't comment. The moment passed, but I noticed how her shoulders sagged slightly, the kind of relief that only comes when someone realizes they are allowed to simply exist without being questioned or judged. We didn't talk much that night. I read quietly in the chair, while she curled on the sofa, blanket wrapped around her like a fragile shield. Every now and then she would glance at me, small questions in her eyes, and I would offer a patient smile, a silent reassurance that she could stay, that she could be present, that she was not alone. Time moved differently in that space. Minutes stretched into hours, and I realized that the ordinary things, the clink of a cup, the low hum of the radiator, the occasional scrape of a chair, were filling the room with the quiet scaffolding of trust. She began to relax in subtle ways, her hand resting on the blanket without fidgeting, her back settling fully against the cushions, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of the room. When the night deepened, she shifted again, as if testing boundary, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where I'd go if I left," she admitted. I didn't respond with advice, instructions, or questions. I simply offered the space between us. "Then stay," I said, steady and calm. "It's your choice, but the door is open if you want it." She exhaled, a quiet release, and leaned back fully, surrendering to the moment. For the first time that night, I saw the faintest outline of cross her face, a soft trust forming that didn't need words to exist. I sat in the chair, tea cooling in my hand, aware that this unspoken choice, her decision to stay, my decision to let her, was laying the first stones of something neither of us could name yet, but both of us would recognize when it arrived. The apartment was quiet, the city outside indifferent, and in that stillness, the possibility of tomorrow felt tangible. She had chosen to be here tonight, and I had chosen to simply be present. The simplicity of that act, no promises, no drama, just presence, was enough to carry us both into the night. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremors before a quiet shift. Molly had begun leaving things in my apartment, small items first, almost accidental. A scarf draped over the back of a chair, a notebook forgotten on the coffee table. I didn't comment, didn't question. I simply noticed, aware that her presence was stretching into the space with subtle but undeniable intent. She moved through the apartment with a tentative familiarity, still careful, still measured, but no longer hovering at the edges of rooms. The kitchen smelled faintly of spices she had brought, the remnants of a lunch she had prepared while I was reading. She had left a dish towel folded neatly on the counter, and I found myself smiling at the small domesticity of the silent code she was sending. I belong here, at least a little, without needing to demand it. That evening, we settled into our habitual rhythm. The rain had returned, light and persistent, tapping against the window in a steady pattern. We watched a film, or at least we did together in the room. She didn't speak much, but her occasional glances toward the screen or toward me were deliberate, as though each look was a question she hadn't yet learned to voice. I answered in kind with quiet attention, a small nod here, a faint smile there, letting her see that she was noticed without the weight of expectation. She had begun leaving other traces, books on the coffee table, bookmarks peeking from the pages, a sweater carelessly draped over the sofa. They were small things, subtle codes of presence. I recognized them for what they were, and I responded in my own way, leaving a mug within reach, keeping the blanket she liked close, adjusting the lamp so the light fell where she often sat. It was a conversation without words, a dialogue that built trust and recognition, piece by piece. Occasionally, she would speak softly about trivial things, a favorite scene in a movie, a detail from the day. But even in her quiet confessions, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, a gentle test of the space I offered. I listened, always, without interruption, without judgment. My calm, my steady presence became a sort of anchor, one she began to seek without needing to say so. There was a moment that night, subtle and almost unnoticed, when she stretched on the sofa, letting her head rest against the cushion, and for the first time, she didn't flinch when I adjusted a pillow to make her more comfortable. The gesture was small, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of trust. She was beginning to understand that the space, my presence, was hers to inhabit, that she could exist without needing to justify. The hours drifted past, punctuated by silence, by the occasional rustle of a page or the faint clink of a mug. The apartment felt warmer, not because of heat, but because of the quiet intimacy that had begun to grow between us. Molly's hesitations were still there, subtle tremors in her posture and expression, but each night, each small gesture, she moved a little closer to the understanding that she was chosen to be here, not because of obligation, but because of simple, unspoken acceptance. And I realized, as I watched her there, that sometimes the most profound connections are built in fragments, in gestures small enough to be missed if you aren't paying attention. The soft codes we exchanged in silence spoke louder than any words ever could, and the trust growing between us was a quiet but unmistakable promise of something lasting. The night came quietly, heavier now with the memories that linger in corners we rarely visit. Molly was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of tea in her hands, her gaze distant, caught somewhere between the past and the room around her. I didn't interrupt her. I poured myself a cup, and we sat together in the low hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds of the apartment filling the silence. "You ever regret being where you are?" she asked after a long pause, her voice tentative, almost afraid to break the quiet. She didn't meet my eyes. She rarely did when the topic edged close to her own vulnerability. I considered the question, letting the words settle between us. "Not if I choose to be here," I said finally. "Regret usually comes when we act without thought. If we act intentionally, even mistakes carry meaning." She let out a small, almost bitter laugh. "I don't know if I've ever chosen anything for myself," she admitted. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup, small circles that betrayed the tremor in family, friends, expectations. "It's like I've been moving through life answering questions that weren't mine." I listened without comment, letting her voice fill the space. "Sometimes, silence is more important than words. Sometimes, presence itself says, 'You are not alone.'" I reached over and placed my hand on hers for a fraction of a second. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. That small touch seemed to anchor her in the room, to remind her that someone could witness her without judgment. "I've been rejected, a lot," she continued, her words almost spilling faster than her mouth could. "Not just by others. Sometimes by myself, by my choices, by what I thought I wanted." She looked up at me, eyes glistening with unspoken history. "I don't know if I'm supposed to be good at this. Being here, being me." "You don't need to be good at it," I said, steady, firm, gentle. "You just need to be. That's enough. Right now, this moment, that's all that matters." Her shoulders slumped slightly, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much for too long. Yet in that slump, I sensed a subtle relief. She was allowing herself to be present, even just for a moment, without performing for the world, without answering anyone's expectations. We sat together, not speaking, letting the quiet wrap around us. I could feel her walls lowering in the most tentative of ways, the slight tilt of her head toward mine, the ease in her breathing, subtle signs that trust was formed, brick by fragile brick. When she finally spoke again, it was softer, almost a whisper. I want to try, to stay, even when it scares me." I didn't move, didn't comment, only allowed a slow nod, a small acknowledgement that she had been seen, heard, and chosen, by herself, and, quietly, by me. The apartment seemed warmer in that shared recognition, the ordinary lights casting long shadows, the quiet moments becoming a foundation. That night, the past lingered but did not intrude. She was choosing the present, choosing to exist in a space where judgment didn't matter, and I was choosing to be steady enough to let her, letting the simple acts of listening and presence speak louder than anything else could. The weekend arrived quietly, unannounced except for the faint gray light filtering through the blinds and the distant hum of traffic outside. I had been invited to meet some friends for a late afternoon hike, a ritual I rarely missed. But that morning, I found myself hesitate. Without thinking much, I realized I didn't want to leave the apartment, not entirely. Molly's presence had become a quiet gravity, pulling the rhythm of my day toward a slower, gentler pace. When she appeared in the kitchen that morning, she was holding a mug, the steam curling faintly around her fingers. "I was going to ask if you're leaving today," she said cautiously, testing the waters, her eyes flicking toward the door. "You don't have to tell me if you want to go." I shook my head, setting aside the small jacket I had considered grabbing. "I'll stay today," I said simply. "No need to be anywhere else." Her relief was subtle, but unmistakable. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Then maybe we can just be here," she suggested, almost shyly, as if proposing something both ordinary and extraordinary at once. We spent the day in quiet companionship. She moved around the apartment in a newfound ease, folding laundry, washing dishes, humming softly as she went about her tasks. I read, occasionally glancing over the top of my book, noting how she had begun leaving small traces of herself in the apartment: a towel neatly folded, a cushion slightly adjusted, a small pile of books she had picked out to browse. Each act was a subtle assertion, a quiet presence that spoke more than words could. Later, she suggested making lunch together. I didn't insist or direct. I simply joined her, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, the rhythm of cooking weaving us together in an ordinary intimacy that carried extraordinary comfort. The conversation was light, comments about the food, the neighborhood, fleeting observations about the rain outside, but it held a subtle weight, the kind that accumulates when shared space and shared choices create a sense of belonging. By the afternoon, we had settled near the window, a faint light illuminating her face as she sipped tea. "I think I like this," she said quietly, "being here, without having to justify it, without the pressure." I nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate. "It's your choice," I said. "You can be here as long as you want. No expectations, no rules." She smiled faintly, a mixture of hesitation and relief, and leaned back into the sofa cushions. I noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, shoulders uncoiling, gaze lingering longer in quiet observation, and the gentle acknowledgement that she had begun to feel she belonged here, not because she had earned it, but because she had chosen it, and because I had chosen to let her. The hours passed softly, unmarked except by the light shifting across the floor, the quiet rhythm of shared space, and the small acts that spoke of acceptance. In the simplicity of ordinary decisions, staying home, preparing a meal together, sharing silence, something profound was formed. Molly was beginning to understand that she was not merely tolerated, but quietly, patiently welcomed, and I was discovering that these small choices, these silent agreements, carried a weight no words could match. And in that realization, the day settled around us like a promise, unspoken but deeply understood. The day stretched long and quiet, filled with the kind of stillness that both comforts and unsettles. Molly had woken with a restless energy, a tension that hovered around her movements like a faint shadow. She paced lightly near the kitchen counter, brushing her fingers over the edge of the table, rearranging things without reason, as if the act could somehow anchor her mind. I sat in the armchair, tea in hand, watching her with calm attention, offering presence without intrusion. "I sometimes wonder if I'm just settling," she said finally, her voice low, carrying that subtle tremor of fear I had come to recognize. She didn't look at me directly, eyes fixed on the chipped corner of the counter. "It's like I'm afraid something will go wrong, that I'll realize I'm not meant for this." I set my cup down, moving slightly closer, not to intrude, but to let the distance feel intentional and safe. "Then you don't have to stay," I said gently. "If you want to leave, that's okay. But if you choose to stay, stay fully. Be here without reservation." Her fingers twitched around the mug she held, twisting it just slightly, as if weighing the truth of my word. "It's not that easy," she admitted. "I've been cautious for so long, I don't even know how to stop." "You don't have to stop immediately," I replied, my voice calm and firm. "The space doesn't rush you. I'll wait. You can take as long as you need." I could see the faint relief in her posture, shoulders softening just slightly, though her eyes still darted with the caution of someone who had been guarding themselves for years. She moved to the sofa, sitting down and curling her legs under her, clutching the blanket I had left for her. "I want to try," she said, almost to herself, "to stay here without questioning everything." Her words were tentative, fragile, but in them, I recognized the first hint of surrender. Not to me, not fully, but to the idea that she could allow herself to exist without constant self-judgment. I remained in my chair, offering no advice, no judgment, only presence. Silence stretched comfortably between us, punctuated by the soft sounds of the city outside. Occasionally, she would glance my way, seeking reassurance that I would not force the next step, that I would not demand more than she could give. I gave only a nod, a quiet affirmation that she could move at her own pace. Hours passed with that delicate rhythm. She began to relax further, small gestures betraying her growing trust. A hand resting on the sofa arm, a soft exhale that came without the tension of caution. a lingering gaze toward the window where the last light of afternoon faded. As night approached, she shifted on the sofa, laying back fully this time, the blanket draped loosely over her legs. "I think I could stay," she whispered, not demanding, not asking, only acknowledging the quiet possibility. I offered a faint, steady smile, one that required nothing. "Then stay," I said. "As long as you like. It's your choice. Always." And in that gentle exchange, the apartment felt warmer, filled not with words, but with the quiet understanding that she was beginning to trust herself, to allow the space between us to be a safe place, and that I would remain steady, a silent witness to the fragile courage she was learning to practice. The morning light came in thin streams, brushing across the floor in a soft, almost deliberate pattern. Molly was already awake, curled on the sofa with a blanket draped loosely over her, eyes half closed as if watching a film only she could see. I moved quietly through the apartment, making coffee and tending to small tasks, letting the hum of ordinary routines fill the room. There was no need to speak. The air itself seemed to carry a rhythm that didn't require words. I poured a cup and set it on the table near, careful not to wake her fully, careful to preserve the fragile calm that had settled between us. She stretched slightly, a slow, deliberate motion, and reached for the mug without looking directly at me. Her fingers brushed mine just briefly, and the faint pressure of contact was enough to communicate a trust that had been building quietly for weeks. We spent the day in near silence. I read, turning pages softly, aware of the faint rustle of the blanket as she adjusted herself. Occasionally, she would glance toward me, eyes questioning, and I would respond with the smallest of nods, a quiet acknowledgement that I was there, that she could exist in her own space while still being seen. It was an intimacy built entirely on observation and presence, a language without words. At one point, she began sketching in a small notebook, her pencil moving in soft, deliberate lines. I watched, intrigued, not because I needed to understand her art, but because of the act itself, the choice to make herself visible in subtle ways, to mark her presence in the room without forcing attention. I didn't comment. I simply let her express herself, giving her space to fill the silence with her own rhythm. The afternoon passed with gentle movements, the coffee cooling, the light shifting through the windows, the soft sounds of the city beyond. I noticed how her breathing had slowed, how her body settled more fully into the cushions. The tension she carried had eased almost imperceptibly, and I could sense that the space between us had become a kind of sanctuary, a place where neither of us had to perform or explain. As evening approached, she rested her head on the back of the sofa, eyes closing briefly, and I realized that words were unnecessary. Our presence was enough. The quiet, the shared time, the small gestures of attention and care. They formed a dialogue far more profound than conversation. When she finally stirred, she looked at me and smiled faintly, a soft, almost imperceptible curve of lips that spoke volume. I returned the smile, and in that small exchange, I felt the deepening of a bond neither of us needed to define yet. It was enough to simply be together, to share the ordinary hours with extraordinary care, to know that presence alone could carry meaning far beyond words. The night came with no declarations, no grand gestures, just the quiet certainty that had grown between us. In the soft glow of the lamp, we remained side by side, anchored not by promises, but by choice. A fragile but enduring connection that required nothing more than the willingness to stay. The apartment was quiet that evening, wrapped in the soft glow of the lamp near the sofa. Molly was sitting there, her head resting lightly against the back cushion, eyes focused on a book she wasn't really reading. I had noticed the key she carried in her pocket for months, always slipping it back into her bag at the end of the night, a small relic of that first night she had arrived with that fragile request. "It's just for tonight." She looked up at me suddenly, her gaze catching mine with that delicate hesitation that had become familiar. "You remember that night?" she asked softly, a faint smile playing on. "When I said, you know?" I nodded, remembering the rain, the quiet, the way she had allowed herself to exist without explanation or apology. "I do," I said, calm and steady, "and I remember what you said next." Her smile lingered, almost wistful. "I thought it would be temporary, just a night, but it wasn't, was it?" I shook my head slowly. "No, it wasn't, and it doesn't have to be temporary." The words were simple, lacking any drama, but the weight behind them carried more than any declaration ever could. They were a quiet acknowledgement of choice, presence, and trust. She set her book aside, folding it neatly, and resting her hands over. "I've carried that thought for so long," she admitted, "that I wouldn't belong anywhere, that I'd always be passing through, like a shadow." Her voice trembled slightly, but it was no longer afraid. It was reflective, aware, almost gentle. I moved a little closer, careful not to intrude, letting the space between us feel safe. "You belong here, not because I say so, but because you've chosen to stay, because you're allowed to, because you exist. She looked down at her, then back at me, eyes glistening faintly, lamps soft. And I think I finally understand what that feels like, she whispered. To be chosen without needing to ask for it, without needing to justify myself. I offered a small smile, the kind that doesn't require response, only acknowledgement. It's always your choice. You can leave, you can stay, either way, it's up to you. But tonight, you're here, and that's enough for me. She leaned back, head resting fully on the cushions this time, a relaxed sigh escaping her. For a moment, the room was filled with quiet understanding. No words needed to define it, no plans laid out, just the simple act of being together, the weightless acknowledgement that something significant had begun. After a pause, she reached into her bag and pulled out the old key, turning it over in her hands. I kept this, she said softly. All this time, I watched her, heart quiet but attentive. I remember, I said, and it's yours, as long as you want it to be. She smiled, eyes glimmering with a mixture of relief and something like hope. It's just, for tonight? I leaned back, voice calm, almost teasing in its quiet certainty. We'll see tomorrow. She laughed softly, that gentle, unguarded sound that I had come to cherish. And I knew in that simple exchange, that quiet rhythm, that something lasting, delicate, profound, had begun. The night stretched around us, filled with unspoken promise, the kind that doesn't demand definition but carries the weight of a choice made and honored.